Hello everyone, this is Miss Siddiqui here. In this video, we are going to talk about the final chapters and conclusion of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. So, chapter 20 is called The Minister and the Maze. So this is the scene where Hester and Dimmesdale emerge from the woods. They've had this kind of really powerful moment between the two of them. They're deciding that they're going to leave. They're going to leave Boston together. And so the plan is that Hester is going to secretly book passage for 2 adults and 1 child on a Bristol-bound ship. And so this passage is going to leave in 4 days. They've talked it over with the captain. And one day after they book the trip, Dimmesdale is to preach the election sermon for the new governor, as the old governor passed, the new ministers for the town. And so what's interesting is, both of them are pretty happy when they leave the woods, but Dimmesdale is really the most affected. He's almost so happy that he seems physically stronger. Hawthorne talks about how he's like kind of looking healthier and lighter, and he's just kind of like endowed with this glow. And later when he gives the sermon, he's like described as having like a halo over his head. So Dimmesdale is really in better shape after leaving the woods. So back in town, when Dimmesdale gets back from the woods, he has like all these kind of irrational temptations when he's encountering people in town. Like he's rude to an old man. He has these really thoughts about like, oh, what if I were like said these things to these children, or just kind of has these impure thoughts. And Dimmesdale's kind of wondering like, have I really sold my soul to the devil? Why am I acting like this? So Dimmesdale makes a plan to burn the old sermon that he was going to read initially at the election sermon, or on that day of celebration, and then he writes an entirely new one. So this change in Dimmesdale and this series of temptations toward like wicked and wild actions shows that Hawthorne is really painting this kind of the subconscious effects that this revelation of sin to Hester is like having on his conscience and his commitment to sin. So now he's sort of like being more able to have impure thoughts because he's not carrying the burden of his sin. So until his agreement with Hester, Dimmesdale's strong Puritan conscience had struggled constantly with his weak will. But now he's made a deliberate choice for the first time to do what he wants, even though it's going to be a sin. And so Dimmesdale's subconscious tries to make his guilt known kind of by doing all these bad things. Hawthorne kind of has this tremendous psychological insight on how a character like Dimmesdale might evolve over time. And so you can see slowly that like maybe through these bad actions, Dimmesdale's trying to reveal himself in some sort of way. And then of course in the later chapters, you know what happens. So actually what's interesting is that Hester almost feels like betrayed by this new look and swagger that Dimmesdale has. And like in chapter 21, when he like walks by her in town and doesn't really give her notice, she's pretty hurt by this. And even Pearl comments like, is that same guy? Like he just seems so different. He's got this glow to him. So chapter 21 is called The New England Holiday, and once again we have the town all gathered like the beginning of the book, and there's this great parallel, this echoing and mirroring of the opening scene where Hester's coming up to the scaffold, all eyes on her. There are all these negative comments about her, but this time Hester is basically invisible in the crowd, and all eyes will be on Dimmesdale today as he plans to give the sermon. And also what's interesting is that in the beginning the narrator was very sympathetic to Hester, and in this chapter the narrator is a little bit like less impressed with Hester. And so when they get to the marketplace where they're going to have the big gathering for the New England holiday, Hester tells Pearl that the minister will be there, but they can't greet each other, they can't act like something happened. And then kind of, they think that the sermon will happen and then they'll leave it in 3 days. But then Hester gets the worst news of all. Hester learns from the captain of the ship that Chillingworth has planned to take the ship with her and Dimmesdale. Oh, I wrote Chillingworth, but I should say Dimmesdale. And so now they've kind of realized escaping Chillingworth will not be an easy task, that wherever Hester, Pearl, and Dimmesdale go, there Chillingworth will be. So Hawthorne comments in this chapter and basically criticizes the Puritans as they've all like gathered in this marketplace. And he talks about the lack of color in the crowd. Everybody's wearing like black and white, and except for the savages who are present, which he's referring to the Native Americans who are wearing more colorful clothes. But he also is hugely critiquing the Puritans, even though he calls the Native American savages, for wearing black and white. And he's sort of saying like the Puritans have sucked the joy out of life with their really strict rules. It's just basically this big social critique of puritanical ways. And so at this point in the book, the narrator is kind of hopeful for Hester, but then of course the worst possible thing could happen. Chillingworth is coming to Europe, and Hawthorne says Chillingworth's smile to Hester across the crowd soon after she found this news out was secret and fearful in meaning. So you just got this sort of like demonic, like, I'm going to chase you wherever you go. Even if you go to Europe, I'm going to go there too. So we realize that Dimmesdale's strength is only temporary in this chapter. So we realize like he's got this glow, he's got this new attitude, but in some ways Hawthorne is indicating, well, maybe this is like the last like burst of energy that Dimmesdale will have before something really bad happens to him, because we do know he's had this chronic, health problem for years, which is psychosomatic in many ways, but he's also just a sick person. So we kind of get this indication that maybe this newfound strength is this burst of energy right before Dimmesdale dies. And so in this scene, we also have this, again, another small scene with Mistress Hibbins, which, the governor's sister, talks to Hester and kind of talks to her, like, indicating, like, I know that you've been to the woods, or know that you've been to the woods with Dimmesdale. She doesn't say it explicitly, but there's this kind of indication. And the fact that this person who practices witchcraft, like, comes and talks to Hester is this kind of bad omen for what's to come. And so these strings of tension are drawn tighter in this chapter as Hawthorne kind of brings each of the major characters to this scene, this final scene in the marketplace. And of course, the point of crisis is about to arrive, and the problem will be entirely Dimmesdale's. So in chapter 23, Dimmesdale inspires the crowd with his speech. He gives the sermon of his life. And the implication is that now that he's been able to accept his sin and is basically taking active steps to commit more sin, he's somehow becoming more alive. But again, there's this implication that this is kind of like Dimmesdale's last goodbye. And so when he finds out about Chillingworth, he kind of realizes this is going to be like his last breath, his last chance to say anything. And so we have in this scene Hester and Pearl and Dimmesdale on the scaffold together. And Dimmesdale says, I must acknowledge my shame. And he turns to the crowd and just finally discloses his guilt. And in that scene, he dies. And as Dimmesdale dies, Chillingworth cries out because Dimmesdale is escaping his grasp. And Chillingworth says things like, now you have escaped me. Now the only thing that will set you free is like telling your own truth or something. And so Dimmesdale asks God to forgive Chillingworth. He asks for a kiss from Pearl, which he receives. And he tells Hester farewell. And so there's this really dramatic big loss of Dimmesdale as he's again giving this sermon of his life. He's having this moment where he recognizes, actually no, I need to out the truth, I need to confess my sin. Slinking away to Europe would not give me total peace of mind. And so there's this moment where the truth triumphs, and Hawthorne is sort of, even though he gives Dimmesdale death, he's sort of celebrating that this truth has set Dimmesdale free. And there's this implication that Dimmesdale and Hester now have had such repentance that in their immortal life together, they might both get to be with each other, since they have suffered so much for the sins that they have committed. So Dimmesdale symbolically rejects the help of Wilson, in Reverend Wilson in this scene. Oh, the light just turned off. Okay, I'm back, sorry. And so when he turns to Hester for support in this moment of crisis, she really can't help him at this point. I don't even know if she entirely agrees with his decision. So he must expose the letter on his chest. And so when the climactic action drains Dimmesdale of his strength and he collapses, it is again Hester whom he leans on, because Hester has been his tower of strength this whole book. She's able to live outside the community. And finally, there's this glow of sunshine, again, this big consistent imagery with the sunshine being freeness and nature, and Dimmesdale dies in this glow of sunshine. And this is really indicates Hawthorne's kind of romantic style in writing, or sorry, he's a romantic writer, and his idea is that only through exposing the truth can love prevail. So Dimmesdale's recognition of Pearl takes place in the form of a highly symbolic kiss. This kiss, because it had never happened before, symbolizes Pearl's acceptance and forgiveness of him. And also, this kiss is said as kind of converting Pearl from this cold and impish creature into a human being, and one who weeps tears. This is the first time we've seen her cry, as a child, obviously not as a baby, but Pearl becomes a person, and a spell was broken, is what Hawthorne writes. So Dimmesdale has now made his place with God, but unlike Hester, he's too much the Puritan to be optimistic about the future. So he dies, and he's not going to have the future that they dreamed of. But this is what Dimmesdale wanted. He wanted to be free. He wanted to confess his sin. So in chapter 24, Hawthorne's basically tying up the loose ends of the book. He says, some people say the mark on Dimmesdale was the result of Chillingworth's, like magic drugs, while others are saying, oh no, it's like it emerged because he was a suffering spirit. And then, of course, we know Dimmesdale's mark is from his own hand, which some people also think. And then other people say, oh, there was no mark at all. And so Hawthorne, to wrap up Chillingworth, he kind of says, he basically just says, oh, he's not that awful. But he does find Chillingworth's sin to be the most grievous in terms of, like, compared to Dimmesdale and Hester. But he then later makes Chillingworth kind of a generous person when Chillingworth leaves all of his money to Pearl. So Hawthorne is not Puritan enough to view the man coldly and vindictively. Hawthorne sort of understands Chillingworth and forgives him as well. So Hawthorne gives strong hints in 24 in the epilogue that Pearl lived on in happiness and wealth. She married well, had a child, and remained an affectionate and dutiful daughter to Hester. And so I think the reason this outcome happens is because while Hester, Dimmesdale, and Chillingworth were all involved in the tragedy through their own sins, Pearl was really a helpless victim. And so then the very end of the novel focuses on Hester and says, after inheriting property and incredible wealth from Chillingworth, Hester went to Europe with Pearl. Hester disappears for a long time from the colony, but after a number of years, Hester returns to her cottage in Boston, where she really belongs. And so Hawthorne neatly ties up the loose ends for Hester and says, although Hester had done her penitence, and even the most strict Puritan would not have forced her to wear the letter again after those events, she voluntarily wore it for the rest of her life, probably to remind herself of Dimmesdale and the love that they had. And so Hester throughout her life gains this kind of wisdom through her suffering, and we hear about how generous she's been to the poor and to the sick. And so after she returns from Europe, back to Boston, where she really felt that she belonged, even though she was excluded her whole life, Hester dies and is buried in the cemetery next to Dimmesdale. And on the tombstone that served as both of their graves was the Scarlet Letter A. I hope you enjoyed our reading of the Scarlet Letter A, and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks for watching.